What's up, guys? Murphy Firearms Training here. So I'm going to do a video today, the top 5 what I consider violently recoiling revolver cartridge combinations. So I want to give you some background. I'm really tired of lists that give you the top 5 cartridges with the most recoil, and they don't discuss the guns that they're shot in. I think it means nothing. Here's my case in point. If I take two versions of the 500 Smith & Wesson Magnum, the one on the left has a 12-inch ported barrel and weighs over a pound more than the 3.5-inch model on the right. Well, I think we all know the one on the right is going to kick a lot harder. So I don't just want to talk about ammo, but I want to talk about the guns they're fired in. So the first thing I had to do in all of this is I had to pick a factory load that would yield a high amount of recoil. Okay, so I chose to look at buffalo bore. Everything that I chose came from buffalo bore. And I also didn't just look at the cartridge, but I looked at the guns. I had to consider things like gun weight, barrel length, and also decided to not use any guns that had factory porting or muzzle brakes because those tend to reduce recoil. I also chose to do revolvers only. No single shots, no auto loaders. I did not consider grip shape, single action versus double action, because I feel like it's very subjective. I've had people tell me they felt like a single action grip recoiled harder, and I've had people tell me they felt like a double action grip recoiled harder. Kind of subjective. Again, no muzzle brakes, no porting, also no optics. Why? Because it adds weight to the gun. So everything on this list will have iron sights. Also chose to do factory guns, no custom revolvers, nothing from Lineball Custom 6 guns, nothing from Jack Huntington. These are from Magnum Research, Smith & Wesson, Ruger, Taurus. You get the gist. Stuff you can walk into a gun store and buy. Okay? Cartridges that I considered include the 500 Lineball, the 475 Lineball, the 500 JRH or 500 Smith & Wesson Special, the 500 Smith & Wesson Magnum, the 460 Smith & Wesson Magnum, the 454, the 44, the 357, the 327 Federal Magnum, and the 4570 Government. Now, I chose these cartridges because I think all of these cartridges are guns that kick. They're guns that the average person who is not an avid handgun shooter, if you hand it to them in a light gun, well, some of these, if you hand it to them in a heavy gun, they're going to say, wow, that's too much. Here's the ammo overview. These are the rounds that I picked. They're all off of buffalo bore sights. So 357 is 180 grain going 1,500 feet a second. The 44 mag is a 270 grain going 1,450 feet per second. You get the gist. You can read the table. These are the rounds I used in my calculations. Now, the guns I considered were the Smith & Wesson Performance Center 3.5-inch in 460 and 500 Magnum, the Smith & Wesson 340 or 360 PD, and the Smith & Wesson 327, all chambered in 357 Magnum, the Smith & Wesson 329 PD chambered in 44 Magnum, the Ruger Super Red Hawk and Super Black Hawk chambered in 454, the Ruger LCR chambered in 327 and 357, and the Magnum Research BFR chambered in 500, 460, 500 JRH, 500 Lineball, 475 Lineball, and 4570 Government. Now, before I move on, I'm going to go ahead and tell you guys, I knew when I compiled this list, the 500 Magnum in the Magnum Research BFR was not going to end up in the final cut because it's considerably heavier than the Smith & Wesson Performance Center in 500 Magnum, and it has a longer barrel. So immediately I know that the Magnum Research BFR in 500 Magnum isn't going to make the cut because there's a lighter, shorter gun shooting the same cartridge. So keep that in mind. But I did mention that only because the BFR is chambered in so many very hard-kicking cartridges. So what did I do? I went to shooterscalculator.com and calculated the recoil energy and recoil velocity. Now, recoil energy is how hard this gun is going to push back. It's simple physics. Recoil velocity is how quickly it's going to snap back. And both of these play a part in how violently a revolver recoils. If recoil energy is the same and recoil velocity is higher for one, it's going to feel snappier. You hear people talk about a snappy recoil. That tends to be something that has a higher recoil velocity. So here we go. We calculated those two things, and I put them into a table. Now, in my first attempt, I added these two numbers together. All I did was take velocity and energy, add them together. And the results were wrong. And here's how I know the results were wrong. I took two guns that I own and that I shoot regularly. On the right, the Ruger LCR in .327 Federal Magnum, and on the left, the Ruger Super Red Hawk Alaskan in .454. Now, what I realized is when I just simply added recoil energy and recoil velocity, the .454 came up one spot above the .327, because the .327 has very low recoil energy but has very high recoil velocity. And what I realized from this list, looking at the guns I had shot on this list and where they fell out, is that counting recoil velocity and recoil energy equally took some of the faster cartridges on the list that are not as snappy as the .454 or the .460 or the .500 and moved them way up the list. And in real life, anyone who shot these two guns would tell you there's a big difference between the two. They are not one number apart on a list. So, since I knew this was incorrect, I tried something different. I weighted recoil velocity times 1 and recoil energy times 2. Now, after publishing this second table and ranking them, and then looking at the guns I've shot personally, I saw that the list looked to be pretty accurate according to what I've shot. So, with that, here comes our list, and I'm going to start with honorable mentions. Several of our honorable mentions are chambered in the BFR, which is a gun that weighs over 3.5 pounds. So first honorable mention is the 500 line ball. Chambered in one factory gun is the BFR short cylinder. It is a 1.4 inch case. There's only so much you can cram into a 1.4 inch case. It's a hard hitter. It's snappy and it recoils. But with a 3.6 pound gun, which typically has between a 6 and an 8 inch barrel, it kicks, but it doesn't kick as hard as some of the things on this list. The next honorable mention is the 500 JRH. The 500 JRH is pretty much a ballistic twin to the 500 line ball. As a matter of fact, I don't know that if you shot them in the same revolver, you could tell the difference between the two. Again, shooting very similar ammo. The only real difference between the 500 JRH and the 500 line ball is the 500 JRH is a shortened 500 Smith & Wesson, so you can trim those brass to make 500 JRHs. And it shoots a 50 caliber bullet, whereas the 500 line ball shoots a 51 caliber bullet. And of course that doesn't make a huge difference, but there are more 50 caliber bullets on the market, so it's more likely that you can find reloading components for the 500 JRH. Next honorable mention, the 475 line ball. This is another very hard hitter, but in a 3.6 pound revolver, it just misses. And then the last honorable mention is actually my favorite cartridge. But unfortunately, all of the guns that are chambered for it are very heavy. And that is the 454 Casull. The 454, chambered in a Ruger Super Red Hawk Alaskan, is a really hard-kicking cartridge. It's not for the faint of heart. You get the chance to shoot it, you should. If you like recoil, you'll love this thing. It's eye-opening. It's honestly life-altering. And if you don't hold it right, it's also hair and scalp parting, because the front sight's going to meet your forehead. It is definitely a hard-kicking gun. However, the Super Red Hawk Alaskan weighs in at 44 ounces. It's not a light gun. But with the short barrel at 44 ounces, boy does it kick. However, I have 5 gun and ammo combinations that kick harder. And here they are. Number 5. The 460 Smith & Wesson Magnum. The 460 Smith & Wesson Magnum fired from the Smith & Wesson 460 XVR Performance Center with a 3.5 inch barrel. This is an elongated 454 Casull. It adds roughly 400 feet per second to every load across the lineup. Now, this gun weighs about the same thing as a Ruger Red Hawk Alaskan. but you're getting 400 feet per second more velocity. So it's definitely going to kick harder. This gun weighs in at 3.675 pounds. It's actually heavier than the same gun in the 500 Smith & Wesson, and that small bit of extra weight mathematically puts this gun at number 5. It is definitely a hard-hitting, snappy, heavy recoiling firearm, and I definitely wouldn't recommend putting this in the hands of a beginner with full house 460 Smith & Wesson loads. Although it will shoot 45 Colt loads, and you can use that to get used to the recoil. Number 4, the 44 Magnum. Now wait. I know what you're going to say. There's no way that the 44 Magnum can beat the 460. The 44 Magnum is way wimpier than the 460 Smith & Wesson Magnum. But that's not true, because Smith & Wesson makes this gun in an Airlight 329 PD. This is a scandium frame 44 Magnum. And so whereas the 460 weighed in over 3.5 pounds, this 44 Magnum weighs in at 1.56 pounds, just a hair over 1.5 pounds, shooting a 44 Magnum. That is less than half the weight of the 460. Now that scarce amount of weight coupled with a 4-inch barrel makes for a very, very snappy gun. If you've ever shot a Smith & Wesson air weight, you know what I mean. And without that amount of weight there to help resist the recoil of a 44 Magnum, it is going to go somewhere. Usually your wrists, your elbows, your shoulders, and if you don't have a good grip, your forehead. Number 3 on the list is the 500 Smith & Wesson Magnum. And this will be chambered in the Smith & Wesson Performance Center 3.5 inch. Now this most powerful handgun in the world, chambered in a very long ported barrel, kicks hard. Chambered in this short barrel with a 3.5 inch barrel, no factory porting, and weighing in at just a hair over 3.5 pounds. It is 3.5125 pounds. This recoil would be intolerable for all but the most experienced shooters. The only reason this gun falls at number 3 versus the 460 falling at number 5 is that because the holes in the cylinder are larger and it's the same outside diameter, it actually weighs less than the 460, which makes it come in a lighter gun, more recoil energy. Definitely a beast to shoot, and it definitely would recoil more than a standard 8 3/8 inch barrel ported 500 Magnum. But it's not the worst one on the list. Number 2, the 4570 Government Plus P. Modern 4570 rounds loaded to plus P velocities, and that means that they're made only for modern firearms. They would blow up a trapdoor Springfield. Are definitely powerful rounds. Now, is it a little unfair since this is a rifle cartridge? Well, I don't know. Here's what I'm going to tell you though. You can buy an off-the-shelf revolver that chambers this thing. And I did consider the 450 Marlin because truthfully, a 4570 plus P from Buffalo Bore and a 450 Marlin are pretty much ballistic identical twins. I chose the 4570 because the ammo is much more popular and it's much more well known. Now this cartridge generates more recoil energy than the 500 Magnum, but it isn't considered the most powerful handgun in the world for 2 reasons. One is because it's a rifle cartridge, and number 2, because it's chambered in very, very heavy guns. The Magnum Research BFR long cylinder weighs in at 4.3 pounds for the 7.5 inch barrel, and that's the smallest gun you can shoot this 4570 in. However, even in a 4.3 pound gun, 4570 plus P ammo develops enough recoil that this comes in at number 2 on the list. It's not ported, doesn't come with a muzzle brake, and there are lots of 4570 loads on the market. Okay? The first time I got to shoot this gun, I bought some Hornady 325 grain FTX ammo, and it says on the box, not for use in revolvers. So I called Hornady, and Hornady said, we don't recommend it for use in revolvers. And I said, why not? And he said, we feel like it's dangerous. he wouldn't go any further. So I called Magnum Research. And the guy at Magnum Research said, if you can shoot it in a Marlin 1895, you can shoot it in our revolver. And he said most likely Hornady puts that on there because they don't want people calling them and complaining when the front sight digs into their head. So, as you can imagine, I shot it. And it wasn't too bad, but it definitely recoils a lot. Shooting a heavy load in this gun can be brutal. Okay? Shooting a 430 grain hard cast at 1925 feet per second, which is a brown bear load, really, really kicks. And it'll show you what violent recoil really is. However, at the same time, that 430 grain hard cast going 1925 feet per second would take any game animal that walks this earth. Now, number one, believe it or not, the lowly 357 Magnum. Now, how in the world does the 357 Magnum beat out some of these big bore 50 caliber, 45 caliber, 48 caliber cartridges? Well, it's simple physics. They make something really, really, really light that will shoot a really heavy 357 Magnum. So if we're shooting 180 grain hard cast at 1500 feet per second, that recoil has to go somewhere. Now the Ruger LCR clocks in at 17 ounces. That was one of the guns I compared. 17 ounces is 1.068 pounds, but that is nothing in comparison to the Smith & Wesson 360 or 340 PD Airlight. Okay, the 360 is hammered, the 340, which is pictured, is hammerless. These guns clock in at 11.7 ounces. That is 0.73 pounds. This gun came in number one in both recoil velocity and recoil energy. So it will push back very hard and very fast. I have fired an air weight in 38 Special. I have fired an air weight in 44 Magnum. I have not fired an air weight in 357 Magnum, and I would really love to see if my mathematical results are correct. I know that the air weights I've fired are extremely snappy and push back really hard. Typically with a lot of shooting will bruise your palm compared to their steel frame counterparts. I can only imagine the same is true for the 357 Magnum, and the math shows that. So here's some extra content. Here are the results of the guns, ammo, barrel length, weight, velocity, and energy of the cartridge chosen from Buffalo Bore. And here they are ranked by both energy and velocity. And if you look, the Smith & Wesson 360 PD comes in number one in velocity and energy. Number one in both categories. Pretty amazing. Lighter guns typically translate to more felt recoil. So notice that these lighter guns, the 360 PD, the 329 PD, although not super powerhouse cartridges because they're the scandium frame guns, come in much higher than you would normally think they would. Imagine if they made a 500 Smith & Wesson or a 500 line ball or 475 line ball in an air weight. I think I'd have to shoot it. Anyway, I hope this has been helpful. I hope this table shows you something. And if you've shot these guns and you have something you want to say about this, I'd love to hear it. This is one man's attempt at mathematically quantifying what's the most violently recoiling gun and cartridge combination. Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'll get the chance to shoot all of these guns and give it a real life comparison. Who knows? But I thought it would be a fun video to do, and I thought it would be fun to sit down and actually mathematically calculate it. So I hope this helps. I hope you enjoyed it, and I appreciate your support. If you have questions or comments, leave them, and I'll try to reply. Thanks, guys.